Okay, I'm going to be talking about trigger events and financial outcomes among older households and specifically retirees. But a couple things before we get started. I'm presenting this work, but it's very much a collaborative effort between me and three other co-authors who are acknowledged on this sheet here. Secondly, this is Social Security Administration funded research, and any views expressed are mine and mine alone. So just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to speak briefly about the research approach, data and methods. I'm going to talk about the sort of events that retirees are faced with and provide rates of which those events happen. And I'm going to talk about the impact of those events on wealth and savings adequacy, and finally conclude. So the basic research approach involves tracking survey respondents from the time they retire and then coding their eligibility for and exposure to various events. The data that we created using this approach is used to pursue two objectives. We're providing estimates of various event rates, and we're providing estimates of the impact of these events on annuitized net wealth and retirement wealth adequacy. So the data that we're using comes from the Health and Retirement Study, the initial cohort. So these are folks that were born between 1931 and 1941. They're first interviewed in 1992, when the youngest of them will have been 61 years old, so just before they're eligible to receive Social Security benefits, and they're interviewed every 2 years subsequently. We're coding retirement on the basis of when they report receiving Social Security retired worker or disabled worker benefits, or also survivor benefits at the age of 62 or older. And then we're also formulating a wealth measure for each wave post-retirement. So every 2 years we have a different measure of wealth based on what happened. And then we're also coding their risk and exposure to events in each wave post-retirement. So this is sort of the distribution of retirement ages that we get via this method of coding. And so you can see it's really skewed toward younger retirees, and I think this is fairly consistent with administrative data, which shows a lot of people receiving benefits at 62, 63, and 64, and not so many at 65 plus. So the wealth measure that we're using is the sum of net financial and property wealth, excluding the value of primary and secondary residences. Primary residences are excluded because we're valuing them sort of in the next bullet point, but the secondary residences are excluded because of a data problem. So we also have the value of the primary residence. Social Security wealth, we're looking at the median benefit that they reported receiving after they retire in the survey, and we're using that to value their Social Security wealth, and we're basically have life tables, so we know an expectation how long these folks are going to live, and we take their Social Security wealth as the present value of the stream of those Social Security payments. We do something similar for pension wealth, annuity wealth, and veterans benefit wealth in the case where we can see smooth streams of income with respect to those categories. And so with this method, we are missing some components of wealth, particularly with respect to the pensions. If we looked at the folks who have at least, who report income from at least one pension, roughly 40% of those are going to be smooth over the course of the time that we observe them. So we're actually not going to look at wealth. We're going to look at something called annuitized net wealth. So basically, annuitized net wealth is the answer to the question, if you took your total net wealth as an annuity to be paid over your expected lifetime, how much would the payment be? So we have to have some assumptions in doing these calculations. So we're assuming a rate of time preference of 0.25, and we're also equalizing the A&W of singles and couples using a 1.66 equivalency scale. So what that means basically is that a couple with $166,000 in A&W is the same as a single with $100,000. So this is the distribution of A&W divided by 1.5 times the federal poverty threshold. And so we can see here that there's a lot of folks who are going to be below or around or below the threshold. Roughly 30% of our sample is below 1.5 times the federal poverty threshold. But there's also a fair number of people who have high A&W, so roughly 8% that have A&W of greater than 4 times this adequacy standard. So what sort of events are we considering? Well, we're considering events across 5 domains: changes in family structure, marriage, divorce, and widowhood. We're also looking at cognitive decline measured in various ways. The telephone interview for cognitive status is a short interview that can be conducted over the phone that's designed to detect cognitive decline. There's also like 10 noun recall tests that are administered as part of the HRS, and we're using the immediate, right after you're given the words, how many can you recall? And then we also have information on self-reported memory. For health decline, we have self-reported health that we're using to code health decline, and also the HRS asks about your ability to do specific things, and so they can answer whether you're having trouble with gross motor skills or daily living activities, and we also know something about nursing home utilization. Additionally, we're looking at whether folks lost all insurance and whether they had very large out-of-pocket medical expenses, which is defined as greater than $20,000 per year. So for each of these events, we're going to have a different subsample. So basically, to be included in one of these event subsamples, the respondent had to be eligible for the event during the first wave that they retired. So in other words, if you're already in cognitive decline, you cannot have a cognitive decline. So we're only looking at people who had good cognition by our measures at the first retirement period. We follow these people until they experience an event or permanently drop from the study. An important thing here is that we're only going to follow somebody until they have an event of that particular type, so we only have one observation post-event. So what we're looking at in terms of our wealth effects are rather short-term measures of effects. So this is just a figure that gives you some idea of how likely these events are to occur in average, and so we're sort of, if we move from left to right, we start with the family structure changes and then move into the cognitive decline and then the health decline and then some of the other things. And you can see there's, with exception to widowhood, the family structure changes aren't that likely to happen to folks. Less than 2% every 2 years this is chance. And there's higher likelihoods of having the cognitive declines or particularly some of the health declines. So these are just average event rates. We also do some analysis where we look at what sort of people are more likely or less likely to have experienced these sort of events. So I'm just going to summarize those results. For marriage rates, they're higher for more educated. Widowhood, Hispanic men have higher rates relative to other groups. For cognitive decline, it's men, singles, minorities, the less educated, and those that we code as retired receiving disabled worker benefits. Health decline, singles, racial minorities, those with less education, and again, those that we code as being retired receiving disabled worker benefits. For the loss of insurance, racial minorities, again, those with less education, and so here, the people that we code as receiving, as retired, as receiving disabled worker benefits are actually less likely to lose insurance. Out-of-pocket medical expenses, there really wasn't a lot of variation there. So the next sort of step in this analysis is to examine the impact of these events on A&W, or specifically the log of A&W. We're going to use a fixed effects specification to do that with sort of an event indicator variable. So just a 0, 1, whether you had the event in that period, 1, 0 if you didn't. We're going to control for some time-varying characteristics, such as if you're married, your spouse's health. We're also importantly including an individual fixed effect in this specification. And this is really important because if you just want to examine the impact of events on wealth, or the log of A&W in this case, and you don't control, if you don't control for individual effects, then what's likely to be the case is the people who are more likely to have the events are also lower wealth, and so that's going to be reflected in the estimates. And so if we just went out and estimated this without the fixed effects model, we'd see very large impacts of the events, but that wouldn't be causal. Okay, so these are the impact of family structure change on log A and W. And I really don't have, these are sort of very odd results. I don't have very good explanations for them. We're going to have to do some digging into these. And I think part of what might be going on here is that with these family structure change events, this is one of the places where we're applying the equivalency adjustment for the couple versus non-couple households in exactly the period that the event happens. So I want to go back and do these, not on A and W, but just on wealth, and see if that makes a difference. The other thing is that these events are fairly rare, if you remember back to the event slide, and so the sample sizes here aren't all that large. These are show the impact of cognitive decline on log A and W. And so because this is in logs, we can roughly interpret these as percentage changes. And so you see there's some evidence of negative impacts and also some effects that go in the opposite direction. These are the health declines, the impact of health decline on A and W. And here there's a lot stronger pattern of negative effects and also the fairly strong pattern of statistically significant effects. I'm going to say these range from small to very large if we're looking at nursing home at minus 0.20 or in a nursing home currently. Okay, and this is impact of loss of health insurance and large out-of-pocket medical expenses. Again, these are negative and can be very large, particularly for the large out-of-pocket medical expenses for single men. But none of these results are statistically significant. So the next step in this analysis is to try and assess the extent to which these events are going to affect adequacy, retirement savings adequacy, where adequacy is defined as having A and W above 1.5 times the federal poverty line, and having inadequate resources is defined as having A and W below that. And basically, we're going to make use of the model that we used, the estimates that I just showed you, to try and get at that. And so the basic idea here is that with that model, what we get is for each person in the sample what we expect their A and W to be, or estimate of what we expect their A and W to be. And then we know that that can be shifted by events. And so we're looking at whether the chance that those events are going to lead them to below adequate resources. So I'm just going to skip through this because I'm running out of time. But these are sort of those impacts. And so you can see here, so I've shown the impacts by A and W divided by 1.5 times the poverty threshold. So the important thing to note here is that these events can have a large effect on the probability of having inadequate resources, but it's only going to be for people who would otherwise be very close to the threshold. So, particularly for this event, I mean, they pretty much die out after 1.4 times the poverty line. This is another one, the impact of 3+ trouble with 3+ daily living activities on the probability of inadequate resources. Again, this dies out fairly quickly. And this is the biggest effect we had. This was the in a nursing home currently. This is a huge effect, but again, it's nearly gone by 1.5 times the poverty line. So this is just last slide, just to provide some insight into what the vulnerable groups might be. And so basically what we're doing here is we're looking at the attributes, individual attributes, and whether those were associated with a high likelihood of event or a low likelihood of event, and then also whether or not the impact of the event was large and statistically significant. And so the groups that I have boxes around are the groups that are at risk according to those two measures, and also have a large proportion of either poor or near poor by our measure. And the bold boxes are groups that are vulnerable to both cognitive decline and health decline. So I'm just going to conclude really quickly. So in conclusion, retirees face a substantial likelihood of widowhood, cognitive decline, and health decline. Some individuals are at greater risk than others. I've talked about that briefly, so I'm just going to skip over it. We have some evidence that cognitive decline reduces A and W among married men and singles. Health declines seem to be particularly important because they occur at a high frequency, and they also have large statistically significant impacts on A&W. Here, married women and singles appear to be particularly vulnerable. And also that health and cognitive decline may have large impacts on having inadequate resources, but these are going to be concentrated on people that are poor, that are near poor.